This is Taos Education and Career Center's Social Studies in Fall 2017. We are reading Rethinking Rural, Global Community, and Economic Development in Small Town West, and this is Chapter 4. So Chapter 4 focuses on federal lands, and this includes the United States Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And as we will see, that all of these agencies were created to help manage the lands predominantly in the Western United States. And, initially when Westward expansion was happening, there was this idea of the superabundance. And on page 62, at the last bottom paragraph, if you look at that, it talks about the myth of superabundance and how this was based on the assumption that the supply of resources was infinite and that wise management was not needed because we really believed in that sort of human exceptionalism paradigm that resources were infinite. And as we learned in rural West and Mass society, that there started to be this dawning realization that this was not true. But you can imagine, as the United States Western expansion seemed endless, the frontier horizon line kept going further and further west, that it was easy for people to believe in this myth of superabundance. But as people started to realize that the harmful practices of just cutting down all the trees or mining whatever or taking as much fish as we wanted, that it really started to have an impact on these sensitive ecosystems. And so each of these agencies was created to help manage those lands in the interest of the United States government. So the first section of the book looks at the United States Forest Service. And if you remember in the last chapter, there was this idea of just of the superabundance, and we were just going to clear cut and take down as much timber as possible. And that started to shift when Gifford Pinchot took over the Forest Service and really looked at conservation. And he looked at trees more from a cultivation or farming perspective, that you could do it in a sustainable way and that didn't overall harm the large biosystem of the forest. And this really looks at what nowadays, because so much of the timber production has been reduced on the basis of endangered species or sustainable harvest or not cutting down old growth, that the timber industry is no longer a primary economic driver as it was in times past. And so what does that mean for the modern world in the West when so much of the forests are owned by the Forest Service, and yet we're not really able to access them in the same scale that we used to for economic development? So where does that force us to turn in terms of jobs and the economy? And also part of this section in forestry talks about wilderness and wilderness areas. And there are some statistics at the top of page 66 in that paragraph that really look at what was the development of wilderness areas. And you really start to see this development of the idea of the value of pure wilderness. And not just for economic purposes, but really from a spiritual perspective and a mental health perspective and just a recreational spend time with your family perspective. So the Wilderness Act was created in this time that wilderness areas were devoted to public purposes, be they spiritual or recreational, scenic, scientific, educational, historical. So there was an effort that some areas of the true rugged wilderness could be kept intact. And so there's a few questions here to reflect about it and wondering your own perspective of whether the wilderness is valuable, why or why not. Many people get very angry by wilderness areas because it keeps out people. And there's an idea that in the United States, our idea of environmentalism is to kick people out. In other parts of the world, there are many examples of human beings living in a balanced relationship in wilderness areas. And they're critical of this idea that in the United States, we have to kick people out of the wilderness in order for it to remain pristine. And one on the flip side of that would argue is that's because most of the people in the United States treated wilderness areas so badly, as they saw human beings be the kind of landlords or overlords of them, versus in other parts of the world where human beings are living in a balance with the wilderness, they really see themselves as an equal partner in the wilderness. So this is a global debate that still runs rampant today, and you can go to college and do your whole major just looking at the value of wilderness and what that means to have wild places on the planet, and what is the relationship between wilderness and humans. So the next section talks about the National Park Service. And so springing right from this idea around the value of wilderness, and there were a lot of ideas going around a whole movement called transcendentalism, which is truly fascinating, particularly looking at our current modern times. And so I gave quite a few links about transcendentalism and Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson. These are famous transcendentalists. And there's a couple links, not so much about their work in relation to wilderness areas, but just in relation to their philosophies of being. And so this idea of creating wilderness areas based on philosophy, based on it being inherent part of our spiritual nature, based on this idea of justice and equality and self-reliance and simplicity, that really we start to see the formation of the park system. And these wilderness ideas became part of our cultural identity, meaning when we think about the West, we think of these vast, open, beautiful spaces. It's very similar here in Taos. It's regardless of who you hang out with in Taos, part of our cultural identity here really is our wilderness, is the mountain and the waters and the forests. And so if you watch any of these, watch the one at the top about the National Park Service. And then here's a question for you as well about the primary struggle of the park system in modern times. So the next section is about the Bureau of Land Management. And here's a cartoon that says the nation's largest landlord. And there are many people to this day, particularly in New Mexico, that really resent agencies like the BLM and the Forest Service, because they feel that so much of our land that could be privately held and that we could be using for economic purposes is held by the national or the federal government, and it causes a lot of controversy on both sides. There's quite a lot of land be held by the BLM, and we learned about the BLM in last chapters too, but if you want to look at why was it created and what types of land really went to the BLM, what does multiple sustained yield, and what controversies do they battle with today? And most importantly, I want you to read an article that just came out in the Taos News about federal lands and the BLM, and there's a link to it, and to write a summary of what that article is saying in its own words, because it really captures how this is a huge issue in our modern global towns, even right here in our town of Taos. And the last section of this chapter looks at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so they really deal with endangered species and also wilderness areas, wildlife refuge systems, and the biotic. It's not just about fish, but all wildlife, and how do we keep the biodiversity of the West and the whole United States alive and well. And so you can see a map here about where a lot of the endangered species are still living. And a couple questions analyzing that graph will be on your worksheet. And a few questions just in general on the right here about the Wildlife Endangered Species Act and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's important to keep in mind that again, there was a huge shift where we used to kill species just to get their feathers, or kill them just for their horns, or kill them just for their skin, and a lot went into the fashion industry and this, and it ties back into this idea of superabundance, that when you saw millions of beavers or wolves or buffalo, it was hard to imagine that one day these species might be endangered. And so again, you see the shift here from the idea of superabundance to now many, many endangered species around the globe. They say we're facing maybe the 6th mass extinction of our times, being almost on the brink of no longer existing. And what does that mean for human beings? So in conclusion, chapter 4, we were looking at all kinds of federal lands. And you can see from this map in the western states here how there are huge percentages of the states that are owned by the federal government. And there's 3 questions to reflect on here, based on not just this chapter, but prior chapters of why does the federal government own so much of the western states? And how does it get to be that way? And there's huge controversy today around land grants in New Mexico, and we looked at that in the last chapter as well. But in terms of modern times, what does this mean for the economy and the global market? And what does this mean for how we move forward as a state? And what is the added benefit or value of having a lot of our lands be federally managed? And in what ways does it make it challenging?